The 13 colonies, stretching along the eastern seaboard of North America, were a diverse tapestry of people and aspirations. From the bustling port of Boston to the fertile fields of Virginia, colonists carved out lives in this new world. They were bound by their English heritage and governed by the distant crown. Yet, a sense of independence, a spirit of self-reliance, began to take root in the American soul. Life in the colonies differed greatly from the life colonists left behind. Vast wilderness and harsh conditions fostered a spirit of resilience and resourcefulness. The distance from England allowed a degree of autonomy. Colonists managed their own affairs, electing assemblies and levying taxes. This taste of self-government would later fuel the flames of revolution. As the colonies prospered and grew, so too did their sense of identity. They viewed themselves less as subjects and more as Americans, bound by common experiences and a shared destiny. The seeds of a nation were being sown, though they would need the harsh winds of conflict to truly blossom. This growing sense of independence would soon clash with the policies of the mother country, setting the stage for a revolution that would redefine the very meaning of liberty. The mid-18th century witnessed a significant shift in the relationship between England and its American colonies. What had once been a relatively harmonious coexistence began to unravel as economic pressures and political tensions mounted. The French and Indian War, a costly conflict fought for control of North America, left Britain deeply in debt. The war had drained the British treasury, and the government was desperate to find new sources of revenue to cover the expenses incurred. To replenish its coffers, the British Parliament turned to its colonies, imposing a series of taxes and duties. These measures were seen as a way to make the colonies pay their fair share for the protection and benefits they received from the British Empire. However, these acts, enacted without the consent of the colonists, ignited a firestorm of protest. The colonists felt that they were being unfairly targeted and that their rights as Englishmen were being violated. The cry of "no taxation without representation" became the rallying cry of the burgeoning resistance. This slogan encapsulated the colonists' belief that they should not be taxed by a government in which they had no elected representatives. Colonists argued that they should not be subjected to taxes levied by a parliament in which they had no voice. They believed that only their own colonial assemblies had the right to tax them, a principle rooted in the long-standing English tradition of self-governance. The principle of self-government, so carefully nurtured in the colonies, was under attack. The colonists had developed a strong sense of autonomy and were accustomed to managing their own affairs with minimal interference from the British government. Each new act, each new attempt to assert control, only served to further alienate the colonists and solidify their resolve. The British government's heavy-handed approach was seen as an affront to the liberties that the colonists cherished. The Sugar Act of 1764, which imposed taxes on molasses and sugar, was met with boycotts and petitions. The colonists organized themselves to resist the act, refusing to buy British goods and petitioning the government for its repeal. The Stamp Act of 1765, requiring stamps on legal documents and printed materials, sparked widespread outrage. This act affected a broad swath of colonial society, from merchants to lawyers to ordinary citizens, and was seen as a direct attack on their economic and personal freedoms. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions condemning the act, while ordinary citizens formed groups like the Sons of Liberty to resist British policies. These groups organised protests, sometimes violent, and worked to undermine British authority in the colonies. The stage was set for a showdown between a mighty empire and its defiant colonies. The escalating tensions and the colonists' growing sense of injustice would eventually lead to a full-scale revolution, forever changing the course of history. The Stamp Act. Congress of 1765 marked a significant turning point in the struggle for colonial rights. It was a moment when the colonies began to unite against what they perceived as unjust treatment by the British Crown. Representatives from 9 colonies met in New York, issuing a Declaration of Rights and Grievances that affirmed their loyalty to the Crown, but insisted on their right to self-taxation. This document was a bold statement, asserting that only their own elected representatives had the legal authority to tax them. The Congress successfully pressured Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, a victory that was celebrated throughout the colonies. However, this triumph was short-lived, as the British government was determined to maintain control over its American territories. In response, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This act was a clear message that Britain would not back down and intended to keep a tight grip on its colonies. The situation worsened with the introduction of new taxes on tea, glass, and other goods through the Townshend Acts. These taxes reignited colonial anger and led to widespread protests and boycotts of British goods. The British response was to send troops to Boston to enforce order, a move that only served to further inflame tensions. The presence of these soldiers in the streets of Boston was seen as an occupying force, and it created a volatile atmosphere. The city became a powder keg, primed for an explosion. The tension between the colonists and the British soldiers was palpable, and it seemed only a matter of time before it would erupt into violence. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships docked in Boston Harbor. In a dramatic act of defiance, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, an event that would become known as the Boston Tea Party. This act of defiance sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. It was a bold and calculated move, a clear message to the British government that the colonists would not be bullied into submission. The Boston Tea Party was not just about the tea, it was about the principle of self-governance and resistance to tyranny. The Boston Tea Party was a symbolic act of rebellion, one that galvanized the colonial resistance movement. It showed that the colonists were willing to take drastic measures to defend their rights and liberties. The British government responded with a series of punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, which closed the port of Boston and curtailed colonial liberties. These acts were intended to punish the colonists and force them into submission, but they had the opposite effect. Instead of quelling the rebellion, the Coercive Acts pushed the colonies closer to the brink of war. The harsh measures united the colonies in their opposition to British rule and set the stage for the American Revolution. The struggle for independence had begun, and there was no turning back. As tensions escalated between the American colonies and the British Crown, colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. This gathering marked a significant step towards unity among the colonies, as representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies came together to discuss their collective grievances and seek a resolution to the growing crisis. The Congress sought to resolve the crisis peacefully, petitioning King George III to address their grievances. They drafted a series of petitions and letters, hoping to appeal to the King's sense of justice and fairness. These documents outlined the colonies' objections to British policies, such as taxation without representation and the presence of British troops on American soil. However, the king, convinced of colonial treachery, declared the colonies in rebellion. He issued royal proclamations that labelled the colonial leaders as traitors and called for the suppression of the insurrection. This response only served to further inflame the situation, as many colonists felt their pleas for justice had been ignored and their loyalty to the crown betrayed. The die was cast, and the path to war became inevitable. The colonies began to prepare for armed conflict, with local militias training and stockpiling weapons. The sense of urgency and determination grew as the reality of war loomed ever closer. In April 1775, British troops marched on Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, seeking to seize colonial military supplies. Their mission was to disarm the colonial militias and prevent further resistance. However, the colonists had been forewarned, and the militias were ready to defend their stockpiles. They were met by fierce resistance from colonial militiamen, marking the first shots of the American Revolution. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord demonstrated the colonists' willingness to fight for their rights and their readiness to stand up to the British military. The shot heard round the world at Lexington Green echoed through the colonies, awakening a spirit of defiance that would not be silenced. This pivotal moment galvanized the colonists, uniting them in their struggle for independence and setting the stage for a protracted and bloody conflict. The Second Continental Congress, convened in May 1775, took on the role of a wartime government. This body assumed the responsibility of coordinating the war effort, managing resources, and making crucial decisions that would shape the future of the fledgling nation. It appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a ragtag force of farmers, merchants, and artisans, united by a common cause. Washington's leadership and strategic acumen would prove vital in the challenging years ahead, as the Continental Army faced numerous hardships and setbacks. On July 4, 1776, the Congress issued the Declaration of Independence, a powerful document penned by Thomas Jefferson that declared the colonies free and independent states, forever severing ties with Great Britain. This declaration was not only a statement of political separation, but also a profound assertion of the colonies' right to self-determination and governance. The declaration, grounded in the principles of natural rights and self-government, became a beacon of hope for oppressed people worldwide. Its eloquent articulation of the inherent rights of individuals and the legitimacy of government by consent inspired future generations and movements for freedom and equality across the globe. The American Revolution, ignited by the events at Lexington and Concord and fueled by the ideals enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, would ultimately reshape the course of history.